All right, it's about time to get our class started this morning. Josh is still out sick. I think he's getting a little bit better. He went back to the doctor yesterday to, I guess, have another doctor visit and get a little bit of medicine, try to help him get cleared up. So hopefully he'll be back with us before too long. When I started putting this together, the lesson that I put together, a couple of weeks ago I taught a lesson and we touched a little bit on Samaria and the Samaritans in that lesson, and several of you came to me afterwards and asked quite a few questions about the Samaritans and about Samaria, and you're very curious about the topic, so you asked that I might talk about that again when I had an opportunity. Well, with Josh being out today, and then Don's going to be gone next week, whenever I put the lesson together, I had enough material that I really couldn't do it just in one sitting. So I decided to break it into two, and we'll have two classes on this. And today, what we're going to study about today is going to be a lot of the historical account that leads us up to the beginning of Samaria and the Samaritans in general. So it's going to be a little bit of a history type lesson that's going to bring us up to where we want to get to. Now, a couple of things to tell you before we get started. Got a little bit new hardware here. You know, I've been having some problems with my laptop or my iPad, so I've got a laptop to replace it. I was overloading the iPad, and I've got a new Bible program on here that I'm trying to learn to use. So if I stop with a bewildered look on my face, I pushed the wrong button. So we'll work through it together. So far, so good. It's working out fine. So I've got that to work on. Another thing that I wanted to tell you is whenever I was studying for this lesson, I got to thinking about how I used to view history, the way I used to look at history in general. And I can remember as a kid, 5th or 6th grade, having to take history class, and I hated it. I just didn't like it. I never did like history. I didn't trust it, to be honest. I mean, you get on the playground around the other kids, you couldn't trust them to tell you the right thing about something. You just stood there and watched happen. It sounds odd, I guess, as a young person that you think a kid's thinking, well, I can't trust this because it's a man that's writing it and it's just put together and that long ago. And I thought, well, what's that really have to do with me? So I didn't care about it. And all the way up through school, I just really never did like history, even all the way until I got out of school. And then when I was converted, around 19, 20 years old, approaching 20 years old, I started really seeing the Bible differently for the first time because I had men that could actually teach me. And then I could learn from it, and I realized, and this is a big history book, and it's really important to me now all of a sudden. So I never did really develop that kind of love for history in general. But whenever I can find history that I can also find in the Bible now, that's interesting. So I like that a lot. So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about is going to link back to historical accounts and things that we can find in the Scriptures in general. And that's something that I do really enjoy. So we're going to have some of that this morning. Today is going to be more of a historical account. It's going to bring us up to learn some of these things. And then next week is going to be more of New Testament work where we're going to make practical application. Now, I know some of you have studied this in depth, what we're going to talk about, and we're going to answer questions and do things in class. Just be mindful of those around you that haven't studied this as much. If you do answer, try not to jump too far ahead as we work through this, and we're going to read some passages that are going to explain some things. So I hope that it's an interesting study to you. I've had fun working on it, and I've spidered off and looked at different things as I've worked on it, and it's been a lot of fun to put this together. Most of us that have studied the New Testament at all, or that has at least attended worship very much, have heard about the Good Samaritan. You know that story that our Lord told. You know how there was an injured individual along the side of the road, and the Samaritan came along after a priest and a Levite had already walked past this injured individual and didn't do anything to help him. And then the Samaritan was one that wound up helping him. Well, that's important because if you've studied it all, you know that the Jews hated the Samaritans. They really hated them. We touched on that a little bit the last time that we studied together. And the fact that they hated the Samaritans and they were an outcast people and the people around them didn't want to be with them, that was a really big thing, that the Samaritan was the one that stopped and helped him. And then what he did, society recognizes that even because there's a lot of charitable organizations that will reference the Samaritans in some way because of how they like to do their charity. So they make reference to that because of the connection that is in people's minds with somebody that's willing to help. So where did the name Samaria come from? Who built the first city of Samaria? And why did the whole region eventually become Samaria? Have you ever wondered who the Samaritans were and who the people themselves came from? We're going to start this study today, and when we finish this study next week, you'll have the answer to all these questions. And hopefully we'll do it in such a way that it'll be something that you can remember. You ask, well, why study this? Why study about the Samaritans? Like when I was a kid in school, why study about something that happened so long ago? The Samaritans and how they connect. And you may be surprised to learn that the Samaritans started out as Israelites. They were part of the tribe of Israel. And then they had things happen that changed their life for them and changed how they mingled together and who they were and how the kingdoms were established. So it really goes back to who the Israelites were, who they converted into, how the Jews were to the point that they were at by the time we read about Christ in the Bible, and it goes all the way down to the church today and how we're supposed to look at things, and we'll look at all that through next week. This picture that you're looking at here behind us is in Samaria. It's a picture that's taken from Samaria, and it's looking northwest from Mount Kabir. Don't know the pronunciation on that. Now, a lot of these words I'm going to talk about, I've clicked the speaker and I've got the pronunciation somewhat down. That one I don't know. But it's looking from a mountain in Samaria, and it's looking, if you look off in the distance to the left, you can see Elon Moreh. And in the distance, you can also see Shechem. And if you study the Old Testament very much, then you'll recognize that name as Shechem. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, we read about these two places. In verses 5 and 6, starting in part of 5 and then going into 6 in Genesis 12, it says, so they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. And that's what you're actually seeing here in this picture from this mountaintop off in the distance. I can't point out which one is which, but it's in this picture according to the person that took the picture. So for time's sake, we're not going to back all the way up, and we're going to go through where the children of Israel or Israelites left Egypt, but we're going to start there, and we're going to say that they left Egypt. You know all the events that happened with that. They got out of Egypt, they got away from Pharaoh, they wandered in the wilderness for some period of time, and then they eventually settled in the Promised Land. And what we're going to talk about here for the next 2 weeks, this is the Promised Land where they wound up settling. And we're going to look at how this divided up, where the tribes settled, and what happened with them, and that's going to lead us into exactly who the Samaritans were and how they came to be. So Israel settled as one nation in the Promised Land when they settled there, and they were a united kingdom. They were under one king at the time whenever they were a united kingdom, and there was 3 different kings that reigned over them. The first king that reigned over them, let me find my place here. The first king that reigned over them was Saul, and then you had King David, and lastly you had King Solomon. And the reason I said lastly you had King Solomon is when King Solomon reigned, he was the last king over the United Kingdom. And then they eventually came to a point where there was a place in history called the Divided Kingdom. Some people like to refer to that as the divided monarchy, but it refers to the period of Israel's history when the tribes of Israel were divided into 2 rival kingdoms. So they left the Promised Land, they left Egypt, they came to the Promised Land, they settled in it, and then they had issues. They couldn't get along well enough to stay together as one kingdom or one nation. So they started out as a united kingdom, but quickly became a divided kingdom. You wound up with Israel to the north and Judah to the south. So the division actually came, or it occurred, under Solomon's son. Anybody remember who Solomon's son was? Rehoboam. Around 922 BC is around what we're going to read when happened. We're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 11. We're going to start about verse 43. And we're going to read a little bit here in this account. And all this starts with Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Starting in verse 43, and we're going to read through this and kind of break it down a little bit and explain what's happening. Verse 43, it says, Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. So a couple of short verses, but it says a lot. Solomon passed, he died. He was buried with his fathers, buried in the same city that King David was. And then his son Rehoboam was set to reign in his place. But it's not going to be without difficulty. In verse 12, you see Rehoboam went to Shechem. Again, there's a reference to Shechem where we can see here in this picture that we were looking at earlier. For all of Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So all of Israel had gone to Shechem, and Rehoboam had gone to Shechem, and they had gathered together so that they could install him as king because his father had passed and he was the heir to the throne in the lineage here. Chapter 13 of 1 Kings. We started out in 12. Okay, that bewildered look already happened. I hit the wrong button, but I'm back where I need to be. All right, we're at verse 12, chapter 12, about verse 1. Let's go to verse 1. And Rehoboam went to Shechem, and all of Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. And so it happened when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, but he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt. Now the reason that Jeroboam had fled to Egypt is because he had devised a plan to overthrow and kill Solomon when he was on the throne. Solomon found out about it, so Solomon was going to kill him. So Jeroboam ran to Egypt. So he was in Egypt when all this took place. So now he's coming back from Egypt. They sent for him and called for him. And then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, so Jeroboam came back from Egypt. He got all the assembly of Israel together, and the whole group of Israel came to talk to Rehoboam, and this is what they say. In verse 4, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. So what they do is they gather together with Rehoboam, and they tell Rehoboam, Jeroboam tells them that your father's burden or your father's yoke was heavy. If you'll lighten this burden, we'll serve you. So Solomon was known for splendor. Everything he built was extra. He had a lot of stuff that he done. If you go back and read Solomon's account, all the stuff that Solomon done had to have money, and that money came from taxation. It was a burden to the people to have to shoulder the taxation that it took for Solomon to have and to build and create and make everything that Solomon made. So that's what they're talking about. And they're telling them, if you don't do like your father and you don't make the burden so great on us, then we'll gladly serve you. So then King Rehoboam, let's see. So verse 5, so he said to them, depart for 3 days and then come back to me, and the people departed. So Rehoboam sent them away, and he had to think about it. So part of his thinking about it, we see in verse 6, and King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, and he said, how do you advise me to answer these people? So he gathers together his father's consultants, and he asks them, how do you advise me to answer these people and what they're saying? So here's what the advisors tell him. And they spoke to him and said, if you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. So these advisors told him, said, if you'll answer these people kindly, if you'll serve them, if you'll give a little bit and you'll help them, then they'll be your servants forever. You won't have issues. It's what the wisdom of these elders are telling him. But verse 8 says, but he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and he consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. So he called in some young men, and he replaced the elders. So right away, when he takes the place of his father, he calls in these young guys to replace the older guys that had this advice for him, and he seeks their advice. And here's what the young men say. In verse 10, then the young men who had grown up with him spoke, saying, thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, your father made the yoke heavy, but you make it lighter for us. Thus you shall say to them, and this is what they say to him, my little finger shall be thicker than your father's waist. Well, that's a pretty odd thing. So in other words, I'm going to be greater. Tell them you're going to be greater than your father. I'm going to be more to deal with than my father. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So Jeroboam and all the people came back to meet with Rehoboam on the third day, like the king had requested them to do. And when they came back, the king answered the people roughly, it says in verse 13, and rejected the advice that the elders had given them. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So you got something else in play here. This is happening because the Lord knew this would happen, and he had told Jeroboam already, the son of Nebat, that this was going to happen, and he was going to put him in a place that he had promised him. So God knew this was going to happen. So here's where the divide starts. Now all of Israel, this is verse 16. Now when all of Israel, it's not really where it starts, but where it kind of comes apart. When all of Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, and the people answered the king, saying, What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So basically what they do is when they hear this news, they figure out taxation is going to be worse. This guy's going to be harder. He's going to be hard to deal with, so we might as well fight this. We're not going to have any part of it. They say, what share shall we have in David? You know, David was where the lineage of Christ was supposed to come down through. And Jesse, the son of Jesse, that's just where the Messiah was supposed to be coming. And it's like we're getting cut out of that. You're making us nothing but mere servants. All you want us to do is work and labor and do this stuff and give you our money. So we're not going to do it. We're going to go back to our tents. So here they are living in splendor, and now these children of Israel are going back to their tents. And they say, you figure it out yourself, is basically what they're saying. So Israel departed to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. As we go forward, you'll see we wind up with a split. You've got 10 tribes in the north, and you've got 2 tribes in the south. In the south, you've got Judah and... what was the other one? Manasseh. What was the other one to the south? Had it written down here. I think Benjamin was what I was trying to think of. Yeah, Benjamin. Benjamin was the one there. So oddly enough, the problem with paper notes is the one paper note that I wrote that down on fell out on the way this morning. So I'm using these. So it was the tribe of Benjamin is what I was trying to remember. So that's the division that you've got. And then as we go forward in verse 18, King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue. So here comes the tax guy. So here's what's about to happen like he promised him. Oh, my little finger's as big as his waist is sending the tax guy. And he's going to come down on him, but let's see what happens. And King Rehoboam sent him, and he was in charge of the revenue, but all of Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste and fled to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So he finds out that his tax guy's killed, and then he runs and gets in his chariot, and he heads to Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? Why did he go to Jerusalem? What was Jerusalem? What was the significance of Jerusalem to the southern kingdom?
It's the holy place. It's where the temple was. It's a place of sanctuary.
Yeah, that was their holy place. That's where they were building everything to worship out of. It was also the capital. It was named the capital city. So that was the place, that was the center of where everything happened. So he jumps in his chariot and he hurries over there to Jerusalem, and he's going to mount a plan to figure out what to do. And verse 21, he says, when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. So there's Benjamin. 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, that he might restore the kingdom of Rehoboam to the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shimei, the man of God, saying, speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and to Benjamin and the rest of the people, saying, thus saith the Lord, you shall not go up nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. Therefore they obeyed the word of the Lord and turned back according to the word of the Lord. So a major thing was about to happen there. They were about to go to war with each other. And then God stepped in and stopped it. And he said, you've got to stop this and not do this and go up against your brethren, because this thing is from me. It's coming back to a promise that God had made, and he intended to fulfill that with Jeroboam. So here we've got the divided kingdom. You've got Israel to the north and Judah to the south. And this division has happened. You're seeing what just happened. So Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, but it wasn't without difficulty. Let's see the next slide. Rehoboam was the king of Judah to the south. So Jeroboam to the north, Rehoboam to the south. And then here you've got a graphic. I didn't make this graphic, but you can see Jeroboam, he looks pretty happy to be the king of the north. Rehoboam, not so much in the south. He's upset about it. But you can see how it's divided up. And you can see Israel to the north. They've got Shechem there that's marked, showing the location of Shechem. And you've got Judah here, the south, in the location of Jerusalem. And you've got the 2 tribes, or the 2 kingdoms, 10 tribes to the north and 10 tribes to the south. The southern kingdom of Judah, because of the religious importance of Jerusalem and because of the promise that was made to come through David of a house or a dynasty would come from his lineage, they got along pretty well in the south. The two tribes down there got along pretty well, and they enjoyed mostly stability down there, but the problems to the north increased whenever they got up there and got settled. So you can imagine you've got two tribes down here. That would be a little easier to manage, I guess, than what 10 tribes would be all brought together in the north. So the north, though they experienced repeated hostile takeovers. What's a hostile takeover of the government? What would that be called? Yeah, a coup d'etat. That's exactly it. So we hear that talked about sometime if we watch on the news. They say, well, a coup happened. Well, that's what a coup is. It's a weird word, but that's basically what it is. So there was repeated hostile takeovers, and during the time of the northern kingdom, there were 19 kings together that ruled through the course of the northern kingdom. But during that time that the 19 kings ruled, there was a lot of unsettled times because of the takeovers, and many of them were killed or removed from the throne forcibly. So they had a lot of difficulty. And out of these 19 kings, we're going to concentrate on two of them. Now, one of them we're going to talk about first is the one, he's kind of the beginning. He's the beginning king. His name is Omri. So he was considered the first king of Israel that got stability in place. He was the first king of the northern kingdom that established a stable, powerful family or dynasty. And Omri and his successors, which was Ahab, Hazael, and Joram, ruled for nearly 40 years and turned the northern kingdom into a prosperous and powerful nation. So we're going to read another section of verses here in a little bit, and I'll go through and paraphrase some of it. It's about 22, so I think we've got time to read it all. Let's jump over to, First Kings 16. A little bit of reading there. So it might be helpful that I just kind of break down what we're about to read, and then as we read through it, that might make it a little easier. So Omri, he was the commander of the king Eli's army. So he was a commander of the king at the time's army, and then we're going to read about a guy named Zimri. He was the commander of Eli's chariots, or half his chariots. So you got two commanders here that we're going to read about here, and you're going to read about where Zimri conspired to kill Eli, and he killed him at Tamarzai. So there's a lot of names there to try to get. So Zimri had been putting this plan together to kill him. So we'll go through and read part of this. Let's see, we'll start about verse 8. This is 1 Kings 16, where we're at, about verse 8. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Eli, the son of Baasai, I think is how that's pronounced, became king over Israel and reigned for 2 years in Tirzah. Now his servant Zimri, commander of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Azariah, steward of his house in Tirzah. And Zimri went in and struck him and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, and reigned in his place. So the reason I think the Lord's telling us the time that this happened during these reigns, it's going to connect together. There's going to be a fight that's going to happen, and it's going to make a connection there together that's going to show us about how long that this fight happened. Let's see. Let's jump down to about verse 15. Now this is where Zimri, he starts to reign in Israel. Remember, he's came in, he's caught the king drinking, he struck the king and he's killed him. And in verse 15 it says, in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri had reigned in Tirzah 7 days. So he's only been in power for 7 days, so bear that in mind. And the people were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. Now the people who were encamped heard it, and Zimri has conspired and has also killed the king. So all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. So what you've got happening is he goes in and Zimri kills the king. He takes the king's place forcibly, and then all the children of Israel, the fighting men, the ones that you probably got to worry about the most, hears about this and they don't like it. They've got their commander that's over them, Omri that they would a lot rather have king, so they just appoint him king. They say, hey, you're just going to have you be king. So now they're going to do something about that. Then Omri and all of Israel with him went up from Gibbethon, and they besieged Tirzah. And it happened when Zimri saw that the city was taken, that he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house down upon himself with fire and died, because of the sins which he had committed in doing evil in the sight of the Lord and walking of the way of Jeroboam, and his sin which he had committed to make Israel sin. So whenever they march on the city in Tirzah, Omri and the army, and they're taking the city over, and he sees this, so he runs in and he burns the palace down. Now that's going to be something that's going to come up in the next thing that we'll read here also. He goes in and he burns the king's residence, or the palace where he was supposed to be. So that's burned down and it's gone now. So then Omri comes in and takes over, and we'll pick up there in verse 21, and we'll start reading about Omri. And I know this is some reading, but we're going to tie it together, and we're going to show you some stuff here when we get through this. I guess before I go any further, are there any questions or comments that you want to make about this so far? All right, starting in verse 21 there in 1 Kings 16. Then the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginneth, to make him king, and half followed Omri. So after this happened, that Omri went in and cleared the capital again, and he was set to be king. Now you've got half of the people that's decided, well, I like this guy named Tibni, and then half of them decided they liked Omri, so you've got them divided in half to make him king, and they followed Omri. But in 23 it says, but the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginneth. So Tibni died, and Omri resigned. So that struck me funny when I was reading this. It says, and so Tibni died. It was like, well, that's unfortunate. Tibni died. I don't think that was probably natural causes, is why Tibni died. So he says Tibni died, and then Omri became king over Israel. It says that he reigned 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tirzah. And then here's where we get to the important part. I keep trying to touch the screen and scroll the screen. So here's where we get to the important part of why we're talking about Omri. Let's see what my next slide is here. So this is the most important thing to know about Omri, 1 Kings 16, 21 through 28. So here's why I read this whole account, to help you understand. We had Omri that was the beginning king, was the beginning king that really set stability into the northern kingdom. But he's about to make a move here that's going to be important to our study of the Samaritans. After he gained the power that he needed to become king and started his lineage there, here's one of the first things that he done as being king. Verse 22, 23, see, 24. Verse 24 is where we're going for. And he bought... he reigned there 6 years. He reigned in Tirzah. And then he bought the hill of Samaria in verse 24, and from Shemar for 2 talents of silver, and he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria. So he bought this hill, one of the hills here in Samaria. He bought this hill, and I can't really tell if I'm reading this, if that area was called Samaria when he bought it, or if it was called Samaria because it was going to be Samaria and it was always going to be Samaria after that. But he bought this hill, and he bought it from a lady called Shemar for 2 talents of silver, and then he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria. Now the thing that's important to think about that is he named it Samaria after the owner. And you also remember that whenever they attacked the city in Timar, the capital was burned down. The king's residence and the capital, and where he would have stayed if he had became king, that's where he could have stayed, but it was burned down during that takeover. So now he's bought this hill after he became king, and he's going to build a new place and a new city, and he's going to have his place of residence there in it. So then it goes on to say, Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all who were before him, for he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin in which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri, which he did, and might be showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So if there's a book of Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, I don't know about it. I've not seen that. So the only time that I really know of Omri mentioned is when it's talking about in this particular text, and then it's talking about when it talks about the lineages that it'll mention him in it some. So then in verse 28 it says, Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and then Ahab his son reigned in his place. So on the left here you can see a tablet. It's called the Mesa Stele. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. So it's a Moabite Mesa Stele tablet. It's on display in a museum in France. So why this tablet is important to our study this morning, it was carved in the name of King Mesha of Moab, and it mentions the oppression of Moab by Omri, the king of Israel. The stone was discovered intact by a guy named Frederick Klein, who was a missionary at a site in the Jordan area in August of 1868. So in this carving, it mentions Omri, the king of Israel. So like I said earlier, history is like, when Don and I was talking about this earlier this week, he reminded me of a quote, and I think it's attributed to Winston Churchill, but again, history attributes that to him, but we can't find where he wrote it down, so I don't know if it's him or not, if you can trust it. But the quote says, history is always written by the victor. You don't usually hear about people that get beat or get put out, or especially those that get killed. They can't write history, so history isn't really written by the people that lose. It's written by the victor. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means the victor can make it sound as good as he wants it to sound, however he wants to say it. But when you have a situation like this tablet was written and they're trying to write down facts, and they mention Omri, king of Israel, well, that goes right into our text that we're talking about. And if you look at the time period when this tablet, they believe, was hewn out and made, is right around that time period. So lo and behold, it links up. And that's fascinating to me that you've got people that are removed from that particular region, that they talk about the oppression of Omri as he ruled as king. Any thoughts or comments so far? All right, the next thing that we're going to talk about is, I don't know exactly how to say that word, the black obelisk of Shalmaneser is how you pronounce that. I've said that several times, Shalmaneser III. So what this actually is, this is a close-up picture, and it was a thing like a tall, you see some of them over here around Tennessee Tech that they put up on the corners. They're a tall, slender piece that kind of comes to a point. Looks a little bit like the Washington Monument in a real small scale. So they made this out of limestone, and then they would black limestone, and then they would bring it to a point, and they would depict scenes on the sides of this, on all four sides that they would put it on. And one of these scenes here on this, went too far. There we are. One of these scenes here on the side of this, it depicts, well, let's be back up. It comes from Nimrud in northern Iraq, and commentaries, it commemorates the deeds of King Shalimar III. So this was excavated or found in northern Iraq, is where it comes from, and it depicts King Shalmaneser III. It depicts a lot of the exploits or the things that he done. And in this depiction, it talks about the King Jehu, king of Israel, bowing to Shalmaneser III, paying him tribute. So what would wind up happening is if you had a king like this that came in, the king exercised power over you, rather than the king wiping you out, he would let you exist, but you would have to pay him tribute. So Shalmaneser, the people that hewed this out, that made this, depicted this scene of Jehu, which was a king of Israel, and he puts on this that he's bowing to Shalmaneser III, paying tribute to him. So all that happens right about the same time too, and we hear about Shalmaneser as we read through these stories. So we're getting pretty close to an ending point. It's going to come out kind of close. So this is ancient Samaria. You can see Samaria here in the star right underneath Israel, where it talks about the kingdom of Israel. Omri built the first city there, and that's where his city was built. As we start to go through next week's going to get into a lot more New Testament accounts. Next week is going to have some practical application, how the Samaritans were shunned, how they were treated, how they were viewed, and how that would apply to us. Next week's going to be a lot more New Testament work. But you see it here in this city of the Northern Kingdom. They eventually have a king called Hosea. We're going to read about him. So if anybody of you want to read ahead about Hosea and study about him a little bit, next week we could do that, or about the Northern Kingdom. So Hosea is going to come into play, and then we're going to see a lot of changes. You can see the southern kingdom of Judah there. You can see where it shows the king of Edom down below. Right up in the top right, the Assyrian Empire is really going to come into a role of importance in all of this when we get to that point there at the Assyrian Empire. So that's kind of all I prepared for today. I didn't want to go any further because when I start this next point, that's you really got to finish what you start when I get into this next point. So next week, we're going to get into that. Any questions or comments or anything anybody wants to say?
I have one, or maybe two. When you read about the kings of Israel, you'll see that there's a continuing verse or something said about him. It says that his heart, or they were like the heart of Jeroboam. They continued in evil acts. And so Jeroboam caused them to have a heart problem. That was the lesson this morning.
Yeah.
He caused them to have a heart problem, and he was worried. That's the reason why he established his temples and stuff where he did, to change the time of religion, what they would worship. He changed it, and he caused the people to have a heart problem so that they wouldn't go back to Jerusalem to worship in Jerusalem, or even Rehoboam. And that's exactly what it says in Scripture.
Yeah.
That it would change their heart. And so they had a heart problem. And then it talks about, again, the acts of those that, I just wanted to mention this, there at 16 and 31. It says, for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. That is a continuation all throughout there in the book of Kings with those kings that are from Israel.
We see that a lot. You know, sometimes under the New Testament, you think about as a New Testament Christian that you've got a lot to keep up with. You start thinking that you've got a lot to keep up with. A new Christian can sometimes think that the burden to bear as a Christian is a lot. Whenever you study with somebody, you should teach them that they have to count the cost, and the count the cost is making a lot of changes in your life. So it's easy for you to look at only your situation and start thinking, well, it's kind of tough being a Christian. But if you really look at the situation they had under the Old Testament, it was pretty hard too. Like they go in and they've got the Old Testament laws that they had to follow to the T, or they would be stoned or killed. You didn't have grace back then like what you have now as a New Testament Christian. And the things that we have the blessing of, you don't have the continual cleansing of Christ's blood. They had to worry about animal sacrifice and all this. And then the promised land, the very promised land that was given to them, had immoral people in it that worshiped in the wrong way. And why they picked up this idol worship and why they wanted to do things like that is very confusing to us, because we look back at that. Why would you carve something out of a piece of wood and then set that on something and then bow down to it when you had God giving all this stuff and doing all that? But it's not that unlike what we do when we fall back into the world, or we pick up habits that we try to let go of or do away with. It's not that dissimilar if you think about it. It's struggles that we have. They had the same struggle. So when we look at them as we study through this and we think, man, they were ignorant. Why in the world were they doing that? Well, if they could look forward and look at us, they think, man, them dummies, they had Christ and Christ's blood and all the stuff to take care of them, and it's like they still try to get where they don't need to be. So I think we could kind of look both directions at each other and feel the same way.
And I had another thing to mention. You mentioned Shechem. Ebal, Ebal, and Gerson is right in between them. And when they went into the promised land, there was this cursing and blessing. Shechem's right in the middle. And so that was the middle ground for them. And they had this cursing and blessing. And so where that would be is right in the middle.
Yeah. Anything else?
You know, you mentioned, as you were reading, it says, is this not recorded in the book of the Chronicles?
Yeah.
I noticed that I've got the Apologetics Press Defender Bible, and it's got a note in there that said a lot of times people see that, is this not written in the Chronicles? They assume that's 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
Right.
Sometimes it says, is this not written in the book of the Kings? In fact, 30 times you'll see references like that. And that's not a reference to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because you've got them referring to each other. They could be referring to each other at the same time, because one was written before the other, and you didn't have a problem. But it secular history books, and as things were going on with the kings, they would record these things. And Apologetics Press got a lengthy article explaining that, just pointing out that for them, they had secular records of these things. And as he would make an observation, he was saying, is this not even recorded in our history book? It's in essence what he's saying.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not making a reference to somewhere else in the Scriptures. It's stuff that was written down. Just like the reliefs that I showed you, the carvings that I showed you, that's a way that they had of keeping up with history. They had annals, I think is the name that they call it. Annals were records. A king might have a whole room, and there was nothing in that room, and we're going to get into that a little bit next week too, to show some of the stuff that they've excavated and found. He may have a whole room that's dedicated to nothing but the king's exploits and the things that he done, the people he conquered, and they'll depict the moment when the other kingdom was conquered and the king is on his knees in front of him paying tribute, or it'll be depicted where they're dragging them out, or however it was that they went. But they had their own history. It was just a whole lot harder for them to write it because, for a time they didn't have paper. When they got paper, then they started having scrolls and that kind of thing. So it's curious why God didn't allow us to find some of this stuff. I think He's allowed us to find just enough to confirm His word for the people that need that, with us finding and excavating some of these things that we're able to dig up. Evidently, it wouldn't be a benefit to us to have all these books that are referenced, or God would allow them to be available. Any other questions or comments?
One more thought. It just occurred to me, you remember in the book of Daniel when Darius is the king, and he said he couldn't, or no, it's not, which one am I thinking? No, it's in Esther. King Xerxes could not sleep, and so he asked them to bring him the history and read him the history. And I would think that could put you to sleep. So
Yeah, maybe it did me when I was a kid.
yeah, he's just kind of reading the history, and then that's how he learns, and that was the same sort of thing.
Yeah. When I was first to become a Christian, I focused on the New Testament. And the Old Testament looked a lot like history to me, and I struggled with it. All these names and lineages and all that stuff. And I really focused on the New Testament. I encourage you not to fall into that rut like I did when I was younger. Get in the Old Testament and see how this connects. Thank you for your attention and your comments, and see you back tonight.